There's been a few times where I've been asked, is there a biblical model that we should follow concerning when we get together, what a church meeting should look like? And I believe there is a biblical model that was followed in the first century. So in this teaching, I'd like to take some time to just explore what that biblical model is. In the first century, we have to realize that the first converts to Christianity, of course, were Jews. These were Jews which had for 400 or 500 years been meeting in synagogues. Following their captivity in Babylon, and through that, they didn't have a central temple because it had been destroyed. So they were forced to be able to congregate in their local synagogues. When they were first converted to Christianity, they wanted to continue and follow that same practice. And if we go to Acts chapter 2, it says that they met daily, that they met on a daily basis, and that there was a full sharing. They followed the apostles' teaching and the doctrine. They met with prayer. They also broke bread from house to house. But we also know that they met in the temple courts. Now, often the scriptures lack, in the New Testament epistles, they lack what we would call a liturgy. What would be the model that a meeting should follow? Well, why would that be? Why would Paul in all of his writings say, when you get together, to make sure to do these certain things? I believe the reason that Paul never wrote that was because it was already understood. The fact is that our first century brothers and sisters had been meeting for hundreds of years in these synagogues, and what they did, the liturgy of the synagogue, they just followed right into their homes. They knew that when they got together, they would take the time and they would read the scrolls. They go to the Old Testament prophets and the Torah, and they would read the scrolls. That was part of their worship service. They also spent time in sharing, in discussion, and what's going on with one another's lives. And they also spent time in prayer. So when the church first was converted to Christianity, they followed and did many of the same things. But the problem was that they were forced out of the synagogues because now they were a sect of Judaism which were following Christ as the Messiah, the Anointed One, and they were forbidden. They were banned from the synagogue. In fact, because of persecution that arose, it would have been a matter of life and death had they continued to gather in the temple courts and in such public, obvious places. Well, through the first century, if you go to Romans chapter 16, you'll see that there's a number of records which indicate that the meetings were in the homes. In Romans chapter 16, in verse 3, Paul writes and he says, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus." In verse 4, he says, "They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them." Verse 5, "Greet also the church that meets in their house. Greet my dear friend Epaphras, who was the first convert of Christ in the province of Asia." See, the church that meets in their house. That really was the model that was followed. We can look in Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 9, and it has language that's very similar. It says, Paul writing, it says, "The church in the province of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Priscilla greet you warmly in the Lord, and so does the church that meets in their house." This is also the same language that's used in Philemon chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, where Paul writes to Philemon, and then he also talks about the church that meets in your home, in Philemon's home. The model of the first century, the biblical model that we can see, was what we call a simple church. It was a church that met in the house. Why? Because that's all that was available to them. And they were breaking bread. They were doing things which you would do with your neighbors, that you would do with your family, which was they would get together and they would set times in the home where they would pray, fellowship, they'd have full sharing, and then they would also share meals, and they would devote some time to the reading of the scriptures. So what is the biblical model? Well, I believe that this was culturally what happened in the first century church because that's pretty much what they had to do. But I think as we track through the Christian history, we see a major fundamental shift that occurred around 320 AD. In fact, somewhere between 323, 324 AD through the late 20s, the Emperor Constantine went on a massive church building campaign. The reason that this was significant was because Constantine, as the Roman emperor, had converted to Christianity, and his background was pagan temple worship. That's the religion that he had been raised in. So once converted to Christianity, he pretty much just imported the temple model of worship and went on a massive campaign of building these temples, or what we now would consider to be first century, or not first century, but early Christian churches throughout his empire. The problem with that is when the minute that the church left the home, it now became an affair of the state. It became something that the emperor oversaw, that all of a sudden there was a hierarchy, a divergence from the people being the priests to that there was a separate clergy group and a laity group. The church got moved out of the home and into a building. And we still have many of the aspects in our modern churches today that can go directly back to pagan temple worship. We have the raised platform, the dais at the front of the church. We have an altar in many of our church denominations, an actual altar. And what would we need an altar for? There's no sacrifice in church anymore. Jesus Christ was the sacrifice. He was the final sacrifice. We come together, and even our communion, we believe it to be more of a memorial of Jesus' life and his sacrifice. But actually, they have actual altars still in many Christian churches. They also have raised platforms, and they have lots of religious symbolism that got imported. In some churches, they even have statuary, which again goes back to a lot of pagan influences. I believe that God, though, is not as concerned about whether we meet in large groups or small groups, or what the building and the facility actually looks like. It's more a matter of the heart. And there's actual times where I believe it's more beneficial for us to meet in small groups. In fact, we call them simple churches. The simple church is a church which meets in the house generally, but it can also meet in a number of different places. The point that I want to make in this teaching is that there is a biblical model, and the people met originally in the home. It got exported to the larger building, and when that happened, it hurt I believe the outreach and the effectiveness of Christianity in many ways. How so? Well, I believe that what it did is it began to make Christianity more of a spectator sport. And I say that loosely in the sense of sport. We now have people which are not as active in participation. It's acceptable to go to church service on Sunday, to sit down and let others do what we should all be participating in. There's benefits to meetings in the small home, because everybody on the small group setting of 10 to 20 people, they all need to bring their gifts. They all need to participate. In Acts chapter 8 and in verse 1, it talks of Paul following the burial of Stephen, the first martyr in the Christian church, and it says, "But Saul began to destroy the church, going house to house. He dragged men and women off and put them into prison." The reason he went to the house, that's where they were meeting. I'm promoting the simple church model and the large church model, primarily because I'm promoting that we get connected with one another and that we use both models. There's times when we need to be able to have that relational connection of being with one another and full sharing in each other's lives in that simple church setting. But we also need times where we can come together and have multiple small groups that can come together for larger meetings, which we could call them celebration meetings, or whatever they would want to look like. Jesus said in Matthew 18:28, he said, "For where two or more are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst." That is the church. Jesus gathered is in our midst when there are just two or more. That's all church is, whether small or big. And we need to make sure that we continue to do everything we can to get together.